Hello everyone, welcome to Mr. Noctory, boring ancient history stories for sleep. Tonight, we'll talk about one of the most stubborn inventions in human history. 2 sticks, not curved, not sharp, and yet they've survived over 3,000 years of civilization. Why did the Chinese use chopsticks? Why not knives, like the rest of the world? Why, in a world full of knives, forks, spoons, steak knives, serrated knives, did they choose to eat everything with 2 wooden sticks shorter than your hand? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from across the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's step into tonight's journey together. Have you ever wondered why the Chinese use chopsticks? Well, it's connected to Confucius and Cardinal Richelieu. I know that doesn't make much sense right now, but it's actually true, sort of. And these 2 men shared one thing. Both hated eating with knives. Now you might ask, what's wrong with knives? After all, we've been using them since the Neolithic era. They're the most straightforward way to shove food into your mouth until you stop shoving. And that's where chopsticks come in. The first chopsticks, as far as we know, date back to around 1200 years before the Common Era in the dusty north of China, full of bronze drums and dry winds. A city called Yin rose like a miracle. This city didn't just have walls and weapons, but also kitchens. The oldest kitchens ever excavated, with ash, bricks, charcoal, and a few strange objects. 2 thin, long, parallel metal rods made of bronze. Modern people look at them and say, chopsticks, an icon of Eastern cuisine today. But people back then didn't. To them, it was just a pair of tongs to grab meat out of the pot, to stir the stew, to pull a roasted yam from the coals. Nobody ate with them. Nobody picked up grains of rice with burning hot metal rods. And nobody imagined that these 2 sticks would one day end up on the dining tables of billions. In the West, at the same time, Egyptians were mixing bread with honey by hand. Mesopotamians were tearing malt bread and dipping it into barley soup. And the Greeks used knives as an extension of their jaws. Knives ruled the dining table, from Egypt to Rome, from Athens to ancient Gaul. No one questioned that, and no one thought they needed replacing. Why change them? Knives cut, knives point, knives stab too. There was no reason to choose 2 sticks. But in that city of Yin, something strange happened. People started cooking stews with water, fire, and thyme. Instead of skewered grilled meat, they ate soft braised meat, red beans, thick porridge. And when it was time to take food from the boiling pot, they couldn't use their hands. They couldn't use knives either. So, they grabbed 2 bronze rods, lifted it out. That's it. No philosophy, no Confucius behind it, no morality, just a simple kitchen maneuver. And that's how the first chopsticks were born. Not on a dining table, but by the fire. And the funny thing is, the entire Shang dynasty, with thousands of soldiers, shamans, bronze statues, and sky worship rituals, had no idea that they had just invented a tool that would change an entire civilization. Like inventing the wheel to carry dirt, and later the world used it to reach the moon. Chopsticks were the same. They began as meat grabbers. No one imagined they would become the way people define civilization. But to understand how they moved from kitchen to table, we need to keep going to another empire where a certain dish wasn't very friendly to chopsticks, millet porridge. And that was where chopsticks almost disappeared. Around the 2nd century before the Common Era, in the windswept villages of northern China, thick with dust and the smell of hearth ash, no one was discussing rituals or philosophy. People just needed to eat. And in those meals, millet porridge was everything. But it was that humble pot of porridge that nearly erased chopsticks from the history of the Chinese dining table. If you think chopsticks, once born in the city of Yin, would march straight onto the dining table and live happily ever after, you might be a bit disappointed. Because right after that, they were almost forgotten. Not because anyone opposed them, but because of millet porridge. During the Han Dynasty, around the 2nd century before the Common Era, the people of northern China mostly survived on millet, a small, pale yellow grain that didn't need much water, didn't need fertile soil. Perfect for the dry, dusty climate, and extremely hard to pick up. The Han people didn't cook rice like the southerners would later do. They made millet porridge, thick, mushy, runny, and slippery. Eating millet porridge with chopsticks was like trying to pick up fog, not a lot of success. So chopsticks, born from the fire pits of Yin, remained just a cooking tool. No one thought to use them for eating. The Han dining table still had knives, fingers were still in use, and chopsticks sat somewhere in the kitchen next to the ladle and the coal-blowing fan. Just like that, they were stuck in limbo between the stove and the table, neither invited up nor kicked out. Strange, isn't it? An invention with the potential to change how people behaved toward each other, defeated by a pot of porridge, not because of culture, not because of philosophy, but because porridge can't be picked up. But then everything changed when the Han people moved southward. There was no millet, no dry climate, only wet rice and sticky rice. And that was the moment chopsticks, after nearly 1,000 years of waiting, finally found the food they were born to go with. When the Han people moved south, they brought with them writing, officials, soldiers, and millet porridge. But the one thing that couldn't keep up with this new land was millet. The south was too humid, too muddy, and far too perfect for wet rice. The southerners had been growing rice for a long time. They knew how to manage water, drain mud, sow seedlings. And their rice, unlike Western varieties, was rich in starch, sticking together when cooked. That was rice, sticky rice, soft enough to pick up, sticky enough to clump, tame enough to stay still between two sticks. And chopsticks, once just cooking tools, were invited to the table. They didn't ask to be honored, but one day the kitchen called them out, not to stir, but to be present. At the dining table, beside a bowl of sticky rice, beside a bowl of vegetable soup. No greeting needed, no solemn ritual. Just simply, they worked. But then rice wasn't everything. The South had more than just rice. There were tender greens, stream fish, thinly sliced meats, steamed shrimp, and all of it was prepared before reaching the table. Chopped small, pre-sliced, neatly bundled. Nothing needed cutting at the table. No one needed to hold a knife anymore. Chopsticks, those two sticks born to pull meat from boiling pots, now only needed to stay quiet and pick up. No slicing, no display of strength with metal scraping porcelain, no cutting, no stabbing, no growling like claws, no threatening like swords, no scraping, no noise. They picked up food gently, like a polite gesture, as if saying to the meat, "Sorry to bother you. I'll just take you where you need to be." And then people began cooking in the way of chopsticks. They didn't tear meat apart at the table. They sliced it beforehand in the kitchen, not out of laziness, but because the dining table was a place for peace, not for acts of force. They didn't jab knives into dishes. They gathered vegetables into handfuls. A revolution unfolded. No declarations, no protests, no bloodshed, no winners, no losers. Only habits changing slowly, meal by meal, pair by pair. Simply, every dish became bite-sized, in the literal sense. And so, chopsticks, from a trivial kitchen tool, became the silent narrator of an entire cuisine. Not loud, not boastful, not violent. Just two wooden sticks, calm, never needing the spotlight. Like two fingers extended by a philosophy. To eat is also a form of conduct. And yet, they managed to hold the entire order of the table. If the food was already cut, if the table was already quiet, if chopsticks were enough as tools, then the next step was to turn it into morality. And no one did that better than Confucius. The man born in 551 before the Common Era, with thick eyebrows and gentle but unwavering eyes, didn't just teach about benevolence, ritual, wisdom, and trust. He also cared deeply about how we eat. To him, a meal wasn't a place to fill the stomach, but a place to cultivate the mind. Not a place for chopping, tearing, gnawing, or slicing, but for thanking the cook, thanking life itself. And for that reason, knives had no place there. "A gentleman should stay away from the sight of blood," he wrote, adding, "Using a knife at the table is a sign of rudeness." To Confucius, the knife wasn't just a tool, it was a memory of the battlefield. In the West, the table was once a display of status. Bigger knives, silver forks, larger cuts of meat. In the East, following Confucius, the table was a place where even the smallest person had the right to reach for the last bite. Its sound evoked weapons. Its motion recalled conflict. The sensation of slicing meat recalled acts of killing. And a meal, whether humble or lavish, should not recall death. In his philosophy, the dining table was a space for practicing ritual. Every action, from offering chopsticks to sharing dishes, was a performance in the theater of reverence. No music, no stage lights, just rice, vegetables, and silence. A slight bow, waiting for elders to take the first bite, saving a portion for the one seated farthest. And the chopsticks, gentle, unthreatening, became the weapons of respect. And so, from his time forward, chopsticks were no longer just tools. They became a ritual, a rhythm, a quiet promise that we will not harm one another, even if it's just over a piece of meat. And from that point on, people taught children to hold chopsticks as they taught them to say thank you. People observed how others used chopsticks the way they observed character. Someone holding chopsticks too high, too strong, too fast was someone yet to learn restraint. Someone holding them evenly, quietly, patiently, may never have read the Analects, but was already living by them. It was written in the Book of Rites. Uneven chopsticks are a sign of a disordered mind. It's no coincidence that the word li in Confucianism can describe both proper morality and proper eating. And so, from Confucius to millions of disciples, chopsticks became part of virtue. No sharpness needed, no cutting remarks, just the right touch, at the right time, in the right company. You might go your whole life without hearing a lecture by Confucius, But in the West, another man, Richelieu, was about to act at the table, not with philosophy, but with a dulled blade. Yet if you've ever sat down at a Chinese table and picked up those chopsticks with quiet care, then you're echoing part of his philosophy, with your hands, not your words. While the East was learning to pick up food gently as a gesture of respect, the West was still holding knives, and not just for show. 17th century Europe was an era of wine, puffy skirts, divine right monarchies, and knives sharp enough to debone someone mid-dinner. In a world where honor was easily offended and revenge was a social art, a knife at the table was both a dining tool and a warning. No one knew when it would be picked up, for food or for blood. At the time, the French didn't just use knives to eat, they also used them to pick their teeth. And not with their hands, but with the same blade they had just used to cut meat. One man who saw all of this, and was sick of it, was Cardinal Richelieu. He was a politician, a religious leader, the right hand of King Louis XIII, and perhaps the first man to ask, do we really need to wield weapons while chewing? And so, Richelieu took action. Not by issuing a decree, not through sermons, but by dulling blades. He ordered the tips of table knives to be rounded, so they could no longer stab anyone, and also couldn't slice much of anything. What was once a symbol of masculinity, power, and possession became nothing more than a dull instrument for spreading butter. The French no longer used knives to display status. They used dull knives to show they didn't plan to kill anyone today. And just like that, the Western knife didn't disappear like it did in the East. It was tamed, not removed from the table, but disarmed. If Confucius removed knives from the table with philosophy, then Richelieu did the same thing with design. Confucius despised knives for their vulgarity. Richelieu despised knives for their danger. But both understood this. Two people who never knew each other on opposite ends of the world came to the same conclusion. To have peace at the table, the first thing you must do is make knives less dangerous. You still see knives on Western tables today, but they are no longer symbols of harm. They are symbols of restraint. A knife may cut bread, a knife may cut steak, but a knife is no longer a threat. And in the East, there are chopsticks that no longer even touch meat, not out of fear of blood, but because of something else, compassion. We cannot forbid human beings from having violent instincts, but we can blunt the tools, so they must choose a different way to act. Have you ever noticed that chopsticks don't make a sound? No clinking, no clattering, no metallic clash like knives and forks against porcelain. They simply glide, silently, as if they're asking the food for permission. And that turns out to be very important in monasteries. When Buddhism spread across Asia, it didn't just bring scriptures, it brought a different way of eating. No slicing, no tearing, no ravenous chewing, no talking while chewing, and especially no killing. In many monasteries, people used chopsticks, not because it was convenient, but because it was compassionate. Some orders forbade eating meat, others allowed it, but banned killing with one's own hands. And in all cases, chopsticks didn't touch blood. No clash of metal, no sharpening of blades, no ripping of flesh. Only the soft bubbling of porridge, the sound of breath, and chopsticks, like two straight lines, lifting each leaf of vegetable as if it was something sacred. You might think eating like that is tedious, but for a monk, The way of eating is the way of living. If you do no harm in a meal, then perhaps you'll be gentler with the world after it. And when 100 people eat together in silence, no knives, no blood, no fighting, you start to feel something. A harmony without sound. Not like a Western banquet, where people toast, clink knives, raise voices to own the room, but a monastery table where silence does the speaking. No one stands up first. No one takes the last bite. No one tells jokes. And no one stabs anyone with their eyes. In that world, chopsticks become part of the precepts. No killing, no competition, no harm. Just eating to live, living to harm no one. If Confucius made chopsticks civilized, if population made them practical, then Buddhism made them a conscious choice. Not because there were no knives, not because they were cheap, not because they made sense, but because I want to live without leaving a single cut behind. You may not be a monk, you may still love rare steak, but if one day you find yourself holding chopsticks gently, no rush, no tapping, no stabbing, then maybe you're practicing compassion without even realizing it. Among the thousands of objects humans have ever created, very few are as humble and as meaningful as a pair of chopsticks. They have no engines. They didn't invent war. They didn't alter history with blood. But by quietly weaving themselves into every class, every era, every meal, they became the softest declaration of a civilization. Chopsticks don't force anyone. They don't raise their voice. They don't inspire fear. But they gently say, I will eat my share without stealing yours. I won't need to slice anything because everything has already been shared. No need for laws, no need for police. A simple meal with pre-cut food, calm diners and chopsticks passed hand to hand is enough to maintain order. Chopsticks don't preach, but they embody a philosophy. Everyone can eat if everyone picks at the right time. In the West, the idea of a civil society is drawn in books of law, in parliaments, in charters. But in the East sometimes, people are taught that by learning how to hold chopsticks properly. You don't need to be well educated. You don't need to be a monk. You just need to sit at the table and wait for the elder to take the first bite. And you've already joined a community of order where no one needs to raise their voice. Chopsticks don't change the world through technology. They change how people treat each other in the quietest moments, when hunger strikes, when the food smells good, when everyone wants to be first. Chopsticks, in the gentlest way, remind us to slow down. If knives are symbols of power, then chopsticks are symbols of acceptance. Accepting that the food may not always be perfect. Accepting to reach second. Accepting to live together without harming one another. And in a world that grows louder each day, chopsticks still quietly remain. They don't need to be understood. They don't need to be advertised. They just need to be held the right way. We live in a world where speed is praised, sharpness is rewarded, and the ego always comes before the meal. We strike keys like chopping knives. We speak as if stabbing each other with words. We carve up time, stir-fry the news, grill opinions raw. And the dining table, at times, is no longer a place to gather, but a place where everyone eats, rushes, and stares into another world through a screen. In that context, two small wooden sticks, blunt, quiet, unsharpened, are teaching us something. Not everything strong lasts long. Not everything that wins earns respect. Chopsticks didn't invent peace, but they remind us that peace begins with the small things. A bite taken in turn, a person waiting for someone else to eat first, a meal with no grabbing. In a world full of knives, both literal and metaphorical, chopsticks are a deliberate choice. Not because they're convenient, but because we don't want to make anyone bleed, not even with a glance. From the courts of the Shang dynasty, through the hands of Confucius, through Han dynasty woks, through Buddhist monasteries, through Richelieu and his dulled knives, chopsticks have still remained silent. They simply exist, quietly, lifting one bite at a time, amid a world that grows louder each day. And if you ask, what can a pair of chopsticks do in this era? Remember, a chopstick alone is nothing. It only works when it has a pair, just like us. Ivan the Terrible, the first Stalin, 1533 to 1547. On an August night in the year 1530, Moscow could not sleep. In fact, Russia didn't truly exist yet. Back then, it was just a small patch of land called the Grand Duchy of Moscow, or Muscovy, if you want to sound fancy. A cold, miserable slice of territory wedged between lurking enemies like Poland-Lithuania to the west and the Islamic Khanates to the southeast. No parliament, no constitution, and certainly no Google Maps to tell you where you stood on the chessboard of European power. In other words, if you were born a king here, congratulations. You had just been cast as the lead in a medieval horror film with no ending. The sky cracked open with thunder. Rain poured like someone was dumping a whole lake onto the city. Trees bent. Wind howled across rooftops like 1,000 souls trying to escape. While peasants scrambled to guard the fireplace and calm their livestock, inside the Kremlin palace, a child was being born. There were no fireworks, no angels trumpeting the news, only a king, Vasily III, standing at the window staring out at the grey sky, clutching his robe and exhaling like he knew. Something terrible had just begun. That child was named Ivan, a baby born in a storm, a child the whole city of Moscow had already heard prophecies about from a mad monk years before. A son born of sin will lead Russia into darkness. Nobody truly believed it. Some even joked that the prophecy was just something a mushroom-poisoned monk scribbled down in a fever dream. But Moscow was the kind of place where prophecies, even the weirdest ones, often turned into internal memos. Until Ivan grew up. Vasily III was not a cheerful man. It had taken him more than 20 years just to produce a son. His first wife bore no children. She was blamed, then cast aside. Vasily remarried, and for years the church, the nobles, and even the commoners whispered curses behind his back. When Ivan was born, Vasily called it a miracle. Others called it a side effect of a bad decision. As the bare-headed infant let out his first cry, Moscow was still bowing beneath the wind, and the church by the river, the one that had caught fire a year earlier, was struck by lightning again. Some claimed they saw the dome catch fire, glowing for a moment like the eyes of an angry angel. Others swore they heard crying, not from the child in the palace, but from the rooftop of the church. Of course, maybe it was just the wind, but in Moscow, the wind sometimes remembers things. The court chronicler wrote, "Lightning struck the dome 3 times, then the fire dimmed, as if it had never been. Nobody mentioned it later. Nobody wanted to talk about signs." But if there had been a modern camera in that room, if someone had stood by the window, looking at the wrinkled face of the crying child under the dim light, they would have noticed something was very wrong here. Not you poured the milk before the cereal wrong, but the kind of wrong that alters the course of history. Not because that child would grow up to kill tens of thousands, but because the wind stopped the moment he opened his eyes. The name Ivan means gift of God. But since when did storms count as a gift? Some children are born to inherit the light. Ivan was born to kill it. Before there was Russia, there was a wrinkle on the map. Not the kind of wrinkle you get from folding a map too many times, but the kind that made Western nobles squint and ask, what's that faint grey smudge? A kingdom? A stain? Or just a printing error? That place was called the Grand Duchy of Moscow, Muscovy, if you're trying to sound academic, or if you're a European noble mocking someone too poor to be playing emperor. In the early 16th century, Muscovy wasn't an empire. It was a small, religious patch of land surrounded by forces that were bigger, richer, and, to be honest, had about 10 times more people and horses. To the west was the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, a two-headed state with 2 languages, 2 styles, but one shared passion, eyeing other people's land. To the south was the Crimean Khanate, a leftover shard of the Mongol Empire, specializing in armed tourism to Muscovy, frequent, noisy, and very skilled at kidnapping people to sell. People in Muscovy had a saying: if you don't see Crimean troops today, it's probably because they took the scenic route to your house. To the east were the Khanates of Kazan and Astrakhan, the final splinters of the Golden Horde, weaker now, but still as disruptive as a medieval punk band. In short, if you lived in Muscovy at the time, you probably felt like you were in a rotting wooden house at the center of a battlefield. You weren't a civilian. You were a temporary prop in a very long power play, and no one remembers the name of the extras, especially when you burn with the village. You always heard hoofbeats. You were always in danger of being taxed from 2 opposite directions, and there was always some monk nearby saying, "Have faith, heaven is closer than hell." And then there was a painful reality. Muscovy had no sea access. No sea, no trade, no trade, no money, no money, no professional army, no army. You either prayed a lot, or died fast, or died slowly, or both, if the Crimean cavalry showed up with their tax invoice in hand. And yet, in that poverty and pressure, Muscovy had one thing in abundance: the belief that they were the center of the universe. Not the economic center, not the military center, but the center of orthodoxy. After the Byzantine Empire fell in 1453, Russians believed they were the last inheritors of the Eastern Orthodox faith. The first Rome had fallen. The second Rome, Constantinople, was erased. The third Rome, Moscow, hadn't even built the gates before hanging a sign that read, "We are the last, no more applicants accepted." And as the famous saying went, there shall be no fourth Rome. If that sounds like a prophecy with a little too much confidence, you're not wrong. But you have to understand, when you live under the daily threat of invasion, believing we are the last pillar of civilization is a way to sleep better at night, or at least sleep without trembling too much. And it was inside that belief that Muscovy wasn't just meant to survive, but to dominate. A new generation was planted. Ivan, the child born in a storm, would grow up carrying all that delusion, all that fear, and all that hunger for conquest in his heart. He wouldn't just grow up to protect Muscovy. He would grow up to redefine it. When you are surrounded by enemies, you have 2 choices: pray or become the one others pray to. You've heard tales of princes raised in palaces, but have you ever imagined a prince, hungry and cold, learning politics by counting corpses in the courtyard? This is the story of a child, bearing the title Grand Prince of Muscovy, living inside a golden cage. And that cage was surrounded by predators, not wolves, not bears, but adults, wearing crosses, holding scepters, and never smiling unless it served a political purpose. Ivan was crowned in December of 1533. Not in the real sense of power. The boy was only 3 years old, but his father, Vasily III, had died from an infection, after forcing all the boyar nobles to swear loyalty to his toddler son. In theory, Ivan was the heir. In reality, he was a breathing excuse for adults to fight over power. Ivan's mother, Elena Glinskaya, was named regent. She ruled in name for less than 5 years. Then she suddenly died. No farewell letter, no explanation. Only a shadow left in Russian history, a child abandoned in a court where everyone carried knives. The boyar nobles, who had once knelt before the baby throne, now tore power apart like hyenas on a carcass. If the court was a zoo, this was the moment someone opened all the cages and forgot there was still a child inside. They placed Ivan in a cold palace, far from the center, only to be brought out when foreign envoys arrived. The rest of the time, Ivan wore rags, ate cold porridge, and if he got a chunk of dry bread that day, it was a personal national holiday. And he watched the people he loved be killed before his eyes. One of his close servants, the only one who had ever given Ivan a wooden cat, was flayed alive for offending a powerful family. Ivan could do nothing, only watch. That boy learned his first lesson about Muscovy. No one lives long here if they don't know fear. But Ivan didn't just learn to fear. He learned to remember. And if his memory were a notebook, every name, every boyar's face, was written in red ink, waiting for repayment. He learned how to fake weakness and how to count enemies. That's why, in 1543, at just 13 years old, Ivan ordered the execution of his first noble, not by sword, by dogs. He unleashed starving hunting dogs to tear apart a boyar who had beaten one of his maids. No one dared laugh. No one dared intervene. No one, from that moment on, dared see Ivan as a child again. From a cold palace and a mouldy bowl of porridge, Ivan emerged, not as a teenager, but as someone who had survived 13 years in hell, a walking wrath, a velvet-cloaked curse, a prince raised by humiliation, hunger, and flawless memory. We often believe children learn to forgive, but for Ivan, every painful memory was framed like a painting, one he would hang in the blood-stained court to come. And it was inside that cage of swords, where every adult was a traitor, every toast a trap, that a dragon cracked its shell. It had no scales, but it had a crown. You can lock a child in a cage, but you cannot cage his wrath forever. A 13-year-old boy, a cold stone room, and a body ripped apart by dogs beyond recognition. Not a legend, not a ghost story to scare children, but an official chronicle, written in fangs and the moans of a trembling court. This was the first day the real Ivan the Terrible appeared. The year was 1543. The Moscow palace was lit past midnight. Guards were ordered not to sleep. Doors were locked tightly from the outside. And in the middle of it all, the boy, not taller than the hilt of a sword, sat on the throne as if he had aged 50 years. The throne was made of oak, but Ivan sat on it as though it were built from the bones of those who had betrayed him. The victim was a powerful boyar. The name doesn't matter, because after that night, history only remembers him as the first man Ivan fed to the dogs. Not his greatest enemy, not even the most dangerous man, just someone who dared to strike a maid Ivan liked. And Ivan, once seen as a living ornament, did not shout, did not roar. He simply gave an order. Ivan didn't yell, didn't frown. He just tilted his head, like calling a cat into his lap. Release the dogs. Starving hounds, trained to kill, 3 days without food. The soldier's hand trembled as he opened the cage, not out of pity, but because he knew if he injured the dogs by mistake, he might be the next one thrown in. And in front of the court, the man was torn apart like venison. No one dared laugh, no one dared breathe. Some fainted or pretended to, just to avoid watching more. The court was silent, as if everyone suddenly realized one thing. When blood is spilled in the palace, it never truly dries on marble. It was the first time Ivan killed, not with a knife, not with his hands, but with will, and the fury that had been simmering through 13 years of living as a shadow. After that night, people began to call him something else. No longer the prince, no longer little Ivan, but Ivan the one who remembers. From that point on, the boyars became afraid. No more blatant traps. No more laughter when Ivan fell off a horse. No more using his name to sign off land-grabbing decrees, because now death had a return address. But more terrifying was how Ivan reacted after the kill. No screaming, no celebration, just sleep. I'm tired now. The next morning, he ate a bowl of oatmeal and asked a handmaiden, "If a bad man is killed, does that make me bad?" No one dared answer. That question, unknown to anyone, would become the foundation for 1,000 future massacres. And that was the point of no return. A child, once abandoned among wolves, had sunk his first tooth into flesh. And blood was salty. They say human blood tastes like metal, but to Ivan that day, it tasted like power and a little relief. Later, when Ivan wrote letters to the church, he would call that act the first cleaning, like wiping off a corner of a table before placing a throne on top. The first to die was to teach the others how to live. In the next chapter, we'll arrive at the moment when Muscovy was forever transformed, as the boy once seen as invisible declared himself the first Tsar of all Russia. But before doing that, Ivan would need one thing: God, or at least someone in a robe who looked like him. The year was 1547. Moscow was frozen to the bone. There was no rain, but the clouds hung so low, it was as if they were whispering to the palace, "Today, a god will be born." Ivan, 16 years old, young, silent, and dangerous, like a predator that had learned to read the scriptures. After feeding nobles to dogs at age 13 now, he was preparing to swallow an entire nation. A ceremony never before seen in Russian history. On January 16th, Ivan entered the Cathedral of the Assumption. Not as a grand prince, not as a boy who had survived wolves and palace coups, but like a flame wrapped in a velvet cloak. Beside him stood Macarius, the most powerful metropolitan in Muscovy, both priest and choreographer of this ritual. They weren't just holding a coronation. They were resurrecting an empire. Ivan, from this day forward, you shall be Tsar of all Russians, not Grand Prince, not King, but Tsar, a variation of the word Caesar, meaning Byzantium is dead, the second Rome has fallen, and this is the third Rome. The crown was not reused, it was reforged in the exact style of the Eastern Roman emperors. In Ivan's hands were the holy orb, the silver cross, and a scalpel. A blade used to draw a symbolic drop of blood from the hand, a vow that this throne would be nourished by his own blood. We of course know, not just his blood, but the blood of many others. The first tragedy after the wedding. Just 3 weeks after the coronation, Ivan held a second event, a wedding. The bride, Anastasia Romanovna, a noblewoman and unknown to anyone, her family would go on to found the Romanov dynasty. Love, perhaps, political calculation, absolutely. But above all, Anastasia was the only person Ivan ever trusted, and the only one he ever wept for. In the early years of his reign, something strange happened. Ivan wasn't that bad. He implemented administrative reforms, formed a professional army, passed laws protecting peasants from abusive nobles, at least on paper. He even convened a parliament called the Zemsky Sobor, something Muscovy had never seen. A Tsar who once fed a man to dogs, now attending democratic meetings. It seemed true love really could soften people. But then, time waits for no one. Anastasia began to weaken. Constant nosebleeds, endless coughing. Physicians shaved heads, smoked herbs, bled her, prayed, and burned every strange plant they could find. But nothing could stop what was coming. Anastasia died in 1560. Ivan sat by her bed all night. The next morning, guards found him burning the bedsheets because they remembered the smell of her blood. Ivan, once capable of tenderness, became a monster with a justified reason. They poisoned her, Ivan roared in the palace. No evidence, no investigation, only a rage like a plague, spreading from her blood to his own. And from then on, blood began to flow again, a crown as heavy as hell itself. Imagine a man who had been starved, abandoned, betrayed by his own family, now losing the last person who ever spoke his name with tenderness. The crown Ivan wore was not just made of gold, it was forged from bleeding memories. If Anastasia was Eve, then their Eden had not yet bloomed before it was sealed shut. Leaving Adam with axe, blood, and a gnawed dream. In his pain, Ivan began to hallucinate. He spoke to God every night. He heard boyars laughing behind stone walls. He saw his wife's shadow sitting on the staircase. And then, one day, he ordered the creation of a nation within a nation, a place where only he held the power of life and death, where no law could reach him. Its name was Oprichnina. In the next chapter, we'll meet the black-cloaked horsemen of the night, the ones who knocked on doors at 3 a.m. just to ask, "Do you still believe in the Tsar?" And even when you said yes, they would still kill you, because maybe you were lying. There's a question people don't usually ask a 22-year-old. If you wanted to turn your country into an empire, where would you begin the massacre? For Ivan, the answer was simple. Kazan, a thorn in Muscovy's chest. Kazan wasn't large. It sat beside the Volga River, where morning fog could blanket the city gates. But for Orthodox Russians, it wasn't just a city. It was a stain left behind by the Mongol Empire, a Muslim relic that once ruled Slavs with whips and smoky lanterns. Ivan grew up with tales of the Khan of Kazan, as if they were monsters from children's stories. The only difference was, they were real. And now Ivan wanted to crush them, so his angel could sleep in peace. "This is a holy war," he declared. "Not for God, not for gold, but for grief. Grief makes men violent, especially when that man commands 150,000 soldiers, and no one dares to tell him, maybe wait a moment." The siege. On June 16th, 1552, Ivan marched his army out of Moscow. Some said he moved like Alexander the Great, others said like Genghis Khan. Only his soldiers knew. He moved like Ivan, a man who prayed 3 hours a day, then hung prisoners on spikes after reading scripture. Kazan resisted. Every Russian army before had failed. Its walls weren't made of wood, but of stone and the blood of their ancestors. But Ivan was different. He didn't want a noble victory. He wanted an absolute one. Cut the forests, dam the rivers, build fake hills, then set it all on fire. For 3 months, Kazan became a human oven. Meat burned, bricks burned, even prayers burned. Only the sound of children crying stayed warm. No one got in, no one got out. Plague spread in the city. Water ran out. Cats began to be cooked. By day 80, people fought over cat whiskers, believing they brought luck when grilled with a dead soldier's liver. October 13th, 1552. Kazan fell. Not quietly. It fell like a god statue struck in the skull with an axe. Ivan didn't just take the city. He killed all the defenders, raped Muslim women, and placed a Christian statue where the Islamic symbol once stood. "This is Russia's Jerusalem," he said, blood still on his cloak. Russia, for the first time, knew itself as an empire. Before Kazan, Muscovy was just a kingdom hiding in the woods, surrounded by enemies. After Kazan, it began to believe God stood beside it. Muscovy was no longer a country. It was a believer, drunk on blood, naive, and convinced it had been chosen. And like every other empire in history, when a nation believes it is the hand of the divine, the rest of the world should start digging bomb shelters. Ivan returned in glory. The people of Moscow greeted him with hymns. In one hand he held a cross, on his shoulder, the skull of an enemy. He was no longer Tsar of the Russians. He was the Tsar of history itself. But like all glory, it was only warm ash before the next fire came. If Kazan was when Ivan put on the crown, then Oprichnina was when he put on the hood. And instead of sitting on a throne reading the Bible, he began whispering to the shadows. A Russia split like communion bread. In 1565, Ivan declared, "I'm tired, I abdicate." A terrible joke if you were a boyar. Because right after that, he returned, with a deal no one in history had dared to imagine. Split Russia in two. One part for the country, one part for himself. Even named it Oprichnina. Sounds like a spicy sausage, but in fact, it was a real nightmare. The part he kept was the richest, most populated, most fortified. The rest, he left to the people. Whoever had guts better not let their hands shake, because soon enough, someone would try to cut those guts in half. As if the king said, "I'll keep the heart and lungs. You guys have fun with the spleen." Black riders, like demons in a dream walk. Oprichniki, the Tsar's personal army. Around 6,000 men, not many, but enough to turn Moscow into a sleepwalk through a rain of blades. They wore black, rode black horses, hung dog heads from their saddles, symbolizing their ability to sniff out treason, and tied brooms to symbolize sweeping away sin with fire. Really, it meant sweeping away whoever annoyed them. They were not soldiers, not police. They needed no reason to arrest, strip, burn, assault, kill, or smirk. Just staring at them more than 3 seconds, and you could be flayed alive for disrespecting the Tsar. Each day, an average of 20 people were tortured to death inside their headquarters. A palace turned torture chamber. No warrants, no laws, only faith. That, Ivan wanted it. Kiss your bones if you want to keep them. The people of Moscow learned a little survival trick. When you see the oprichniki pass, kiss your own wrist, because tomorrow you might not have hands to kiss. They were the embodiment of government-backed darkness, and Ivan was the one who signed the budget for that darkness. He didn't just approve, he rode with them. He personally judged, sentenced, burned alive, and dunked heads in holy water, sometimes literally. No one is allowed to betray, he said. But who was the traitor? Anyone could be. A glance the wrong way, a joke misheard, a bird singing out of tune by your window. And when the snow turned red, in 1570, Ivan declared the city of Novgorod guilty of treason. No evidence, just a hunch. The hunch of a man who believed his wife was poisoned, and then poisoned every handmaiden in her chamber. For 5 weeks, the oprichniki slaughtered over 10,000 people in Novgorod. No distinction between soldier, peasant, infant, or monk. People were tied and thrown into the frozen river. If they swam up, they were axed. If they didn't, they were pulled out with nets, then burned along with holy books. Traders don't need hell, because I have brought hell to them, Ivan said upon return. The emblem of a sick empire. For over 7 years, the oprichniki didn't just kill. They replaced the old nobles, seized land, split gold, married the widows of the men they had just executed. A new feudal system, built not on law, but on fear, where loyalty was measured by how many people you accused, where honor was traded for how many heads you cut, and where even souls, if they remained, had to wear badges. If Muscovy were a body, then Oprichnina was a cancer wearing a royal seal, and the only one immune to it was the man who planted it. If Kazan was when Ivan put on the crown, then Oprichnina was when he put on the hood. And instead of sitting on a throne reading the Bible, he began whispering to the shadows. A Russia split like communion bread. In 1565, Ivan declared, "I'm tired, I abdicate." A terrible joke, if you were a boyar. Because right after that, he returned, with a deal no one in history had dared to imagine. Split Russia in two. One part for the country, one part for himself. Ivan named it Oprichnina. Sounds like a spicy sausage, but in fact, it was a real nightmare. The part he kept was the richest, most populated, most fortified. The rest, he left to the people. Whoever had guts better not let their hands shake, because soon enough, someone would try to cut those guts in half. As if the king said, "I'll keep the heart and lungs. You guys, have fun with the spleen." Black riders, like demons in a dream walk. Oprichniki, the Tsar's personal army, around 6,000 men, not many, but enough to turn Moscow into a sleepwalk through a rain of blades. They wore black, rode black horses, hung dog heads from their saddles, symbolizing their ability to sniff out treason, and tied brooms to symbolize sweeping away sin with fire. Really, it meant sweeping away whoever annoyed them. They were not soldiers, not police. They needed no reason to arrest, strip, burn, assault, kill, or smirk. Just staring at them more than 3 seconds, and you could be flayed alive for disrespecting the Tsar. Each day, an average of 20 people were tortured to death inside their headquarters, a palace turned torture chamber. No warrants, no laws, only faith. That Ivan wanted it. Kiss your bones if you want to keep them. The people of Moscow learned a little survival trick. When you see the oprichniki pass, kiss your own wrist. Because tomorrow, you might not have hands to kiss. They were the embodiment of government-backed darkness, and Ivan was the one who signed the budget for that darkness. He didn't just approve, he rode with them. He personally judged, sentenced, burned alive, and dunked heads in holy water, sometimes literally. No one is allowed to betray, he said. But who was the traitor? Anyone could be. A glance the wrong way, a joke misheard, a bird singing out of tune by your window. And when the snow turned red. In 1570, Ivan declared the city of Novgorod guilty of treason. No evidence, just a hunch. The hunch of a man who believed his wife was poisoned, and then poisoned every handmaiden in her chamber. For 5 weeks, the oprichniki slaughtered over 10,000 people in Novgorod. No distinction between soldier, peasant, infant, or monk. People were tied and thrown into the frozen river. If they swam up, they were axed. If they didn't, they were pulled out with nets, then burned along with holy books. Traitors don't need hell, because I've brought hell to them, Ivan said upon return. The emblem of a sick empire. For over 7 years, the oprichniki didn't just kill. They replaced the old nobles, seized land, split gold, married the widows of the men they had just executed. A new feudal system, built not on law, but on fear, where loyalty was measured by how many people you accused, where honor was traded for how many heads you cut, and where even souls, if they remained, had to wear badges. If Muscovy were a body, then Oprichnina was a cancer wearing a royal seal, and the only one immune to it was the man who planted it. Some massacres make it into history books, some are forgotten. And then there's one, like Novgorod, once the commercial capital of Russia, erased from the map by hands of the same nationality, not by invaders, not by natural disasters, but by a king in a crisis of faith, when a hunch becomes a death sentence. In 1570, Ivan woke up in the Kremlin. He looked outside. Snow was falling. Suddenly, a thought flashed through his mind. Novgorod is planning to betray me. No evidence, no secret letters, just the sound of a bird singing off-key at dawn. Maybe it was a bird, maybe just a bout of gas. But to Ivan, it was the whisper of God, and he thought, oh, so God speaks. Owl. He ordered the oprichniki to gather. Over 6,000 black horsemen rode north, carrying axes, ropes, Bibles, and plenty of gunpowder. The whole city trembled, but no one could have imagined the nightmare waiting for them. January, blood thinned with ice. January 2nd, 1570. The oprichniki entered the city like a black storm. No decrees read, no negotiations, no names asked, just silence, and then killing. People were bound and thrown into the frozen Volkhov River. If you floated up, you were axed. If you sank, you were evading justice and pulled out to be burned along with holy books. Children had stones tied to them and were floated off like winter offerings. Monks were stripped, shaved bald, and forced to sing while burning alive. Those who didn't die had to applaud. This is not punishment, this is purification, said one oprichnik. The city that once echoed with sermons now only heard the sound of bones cracking on ice. A dead city, but the churches stayed open. For 5 weeks, the oprichniki searched every house, every wine cellar, every corner. Anyone who had written to or traded with Lithuania was impaled. Anyone who hadn't written anything was also impaled for suspicious silence. Churches became holding camps, altars puddled with blood. One resident recalled, "I saw a man smiling as his hand was chopped off, because it was the first time he got to speak to someone in power." When the oprichniki left, on February 12th, Novgorod was no longer a city. It was a mass mummy, preserved in fear. No one knows the exact number. Some records say 6,000. Others say 15,000. But the number isn't the point. The point is, it wasn't a foreign enemy. It was Russians killing Russians in the name of patriotism. "I have saved Russia," Ivan declared. And maybe he truly believed it, like a man who burns down his house to kill the cockroaches, then proudly warms his hands on the ashes. An empire can survive war, famine, rebellion, the winter of 1571, but not its own founder. When the father is king, and the king is a holy demon, Ivan IV conquered Kazan, burned Novgorod, turned Russia from a small name into a bloody declaration. But there was one enemy he couldn't defeat: himself. After the death of Anastasia, the only woman he believed had no plot, Ivan began to lose direction, then faith, then control. He suspected everything: soldiers, priests, villagers, his own shadow, and even his own son. Young Ivan, a worthy heir, is a threat. Prince Ivan was not like his father, not cruel, not paranoid, not the type to torture cats in his spare time. He was a skilled commander, a fine rider, a disciplined leader, even popular with the people, which, in those times, was dangerous. One day, a group of boyars sent a letter to the Kremlin, just a polite suggestion. "Your Majesty, perhaps, let the prince command the army." Command, not succeed, just a middle management gig. But to Ivan, it was a coded coup, a stick, a skull, a mistake you can't take back. November 1581. Ivan walked past the palace halls and saw his daughter-in-law, pregnant. She wore a thin dress, improper. Ivan was enraged. No words, no shouting, just picked up a stick and struck. Once, twice, 10 times. She fell. The unborn child was lost. Prince Ivan rushed in, confronted his father with a single question: "Why?" Ivan didn't answer. He held the bloodied stick and struck his son on the head. A crack, like a skull breaking. A father. That never finished. The prince collapsed. Blood spilled across the marble floor. "Oh God, what have I done?" They say Ivan wept over his son's body for 3 days, refused to eat, refused to sleep, refused to forgive himself. But it was too late. With that fatal blow, he didn't just kill a man, he killed the future of his own dynasty. Only Fyodor remained, the surviving son. But Fyodor was weak, slow, lonely, and afraid of bright lights. All of Russia knew, when Ivan died, Fyodor wouldn't rule. He'd be ruled. A new era was coming, one with no hands on the wheel, and it all began with a blow that didn't need to happen, an old stick, and a father too used to proving love through violence. They say history doesn't repeat, but in Russia, it doesn't need to. It just changes names. An empire dies, but the spirit lives on. In 1584, Ivan the Terrible died. Some say he had a stroke while playing chess. Some say he was strangled by the same men who once knelt and kissed his ring. Either way, Russia had no Tsar, only a weak air and a pool of blood not yet dry. The next 15 years became a historical nightmare known as the Time of Troubles. Murder, usurpation, invasion, civil war, famine, until the Romanovs came to power and began writing the first chapters of modern Russia. But Ivan never really died. He was reborn, in a shorter body, with less beard, but 100 times more powerful. His name was Joseph Stalin. From seminary to gulag, Stalin once studied in seminary, like Ivan, who loved rituals. Stalin hated aristocrats, like Ivan, who despised boyars. Stalin founded the NKVD secret police, with the exact same function as the Oprichniki. The only difference, the NKVD had guns, and a victim list that stretched all the way to Siberia. Like Ivan, Stalin trusted no one. He killed comrades, killed classmates, killed his wife, indirectly, even killed his own doctor for being too honest in his diagnosis. One day, Stalin read the biography of Ivan Grozny, Ivan the Terrible, and loved it. He ordered a movie praising Ivan. In the film, Ivan appeared as a misunderstood genius, a man who had to be strong because he had no other choice. Exactly how Stalin wanted to be remembered. When crimes need no reason, only precedent. In the 1930s, Stalin launched the Great Purge, a massive political cleansing, modeled exactly after what Ivan had tried 400 years earlier. From secret executions, forced confessions, to scripted torture, every detail felt like a copy-paste from the Oprichniki era. Stalin didn't burn churches, he turned them into grain silos. He didn't throw people into rivers, he sent them by train to die frozen in the gulags. A Frenchman once asked a Soviet official, "How many people are you planning to kill?" The man answered, without smiling, "We don't kill people. We correct historical mistakes." That answer, Ivan could have given too. The first seed, planted by an iron rod, the blow that killed Prince Ivan in 1581, didn't just end a dynasty. It began a tradition of ruling by fear, by death, by the will of one and the silence of millions. From Ivan to Stalin, they weren't two names. They were two storms, blowing across a land too familiar with snow and blood. Only one small difference. Ivan was called the Terrible, Grozny. Stalin was called the Father of Nations. But if you asked the dead, they probably couldn't tell the difference. Barton's Spartacus, the slave who made Rome tremble. One night, no sound, no torchlight, in a crude earthen room in Capua, where slaves lived like weeds growing behind the stables, a Thracian woman awoke because something cold had touched her skin. She turned to look at her husband, and then she saw it. Before she could even call his name, she had to spend a few seconds wondering whether she was dreaming, or had just stepped into the prologue of a real tragedy. A snake, thin, long, silent, was coiling around Spartacus's face, as if it were whispering a curse into the forehead of a man who didn't yet know he was about to become a symbol. A symbol that, if he lived in today's world, might have been printed on a poster that read, "Freedom or death, even if you start behind a cowshed." No one screamed. No one cut the snake's head off. The woman wasn't afraid. She was Thracian. In that land, omens were never ignored. The Thracians believed snakes were messengers of ancestral spirits. As long as it didn't bite, It meant something grand was being whispered. She believed it was a sign. Her husband would be covered in a force, vast, dark and violent, like the creature slithering across his skin. A kind of power that could shake the clouds above the heads of those who ruled the earth. She didn't know. That power didn't come from the gods. Not from temples, not from any Roman Jupiter. It came from something simpler, closer. Humiliation, hunger, and a fury smouldering like coal buried under a volcano. Spartacus, at that moment, was still asleep. He didn't know he had just been anointed by a creature, like how emperors were once anointed by priests. And if he was dreaming, he was probably dreaming that he was still a soldier, not a tagged commodity lying beside a basket of onions at the Capua slave market. But if the Roman Empire could be built by violence and symbols, then a slave could become a symbol of resistance just by receiving a gaze from a snake. Later, people would ask, what started Spartacus's rebellion? The answer wasn't in strategy, nor in philosophy. It was in that moment when a man had a snake curl around his face and did not run. In the 1st century before Christ, Rome was no longer a city. It was a machine that fed on stone, iron, blood, and people. No off switch, no lunch break. And if you asked it what HR meant, it would probably answer with a trident. It turned on slaves, ran on war, and it didn't know how to stop. Every expedition was a startup of the grinder, grinding down land, villages, languages, and the will of those who didn't speak Latin. Roman legions, with nailed boots and long spears, marched like gears made of spine. If you were captured, you didn't die right away. You became a unit of production, forced to plough fields, build bridges, pull carts, dig tunnels, or, if strong enough, thrown into the arena as prey for lions and the crowd. The Romans called it utilitas, which means usefulness. Usefulness, even in death. Spartacus was once such a gear. Born around the year 111 before Christ, in the region of Thrace, now Bulgaria, he had been a mercenary, then captured by the Roman army at a young age. No one knows exactly why. Maybe he rebelled, or simply stood on the wrong side of the battlefield. But the result was the same. Sold, stripped, sent to Capua, where men were sharpened like blades. There, Spartacus wasn't called by name. He was called by body type, race, and betting odds. He was a mumeo, a heavyweight gladiator with a fully enclosed bronze helmet, a shield heavy as a prison door, and a short gladius barely long enough to stab someone standing close. If this were a game, he'd be the tank. Slow steps, heavy blocks, one swing worthy of a highlight reel. But unfortunately, there was no restart button here. The crowd loved warriors like him, because when the blood splashed, it went straight to the front row. Some even brought white cloths, not to wave, but to wipe blood off their togas. Why Capua? Because Capua wasn't just a city, it was a death factory. People called it Ludus Gladiatorius, the gladiator school. There, men were turned into tools. They weren't taught to live, but to die beautifully. Spartacus once held a real sword in the army. Now, he held a fake sword to practice slicing air, until real blood sprayed under the arena sun. The Roman machine didn't care where you came from or who you used to be, as long as you made the gears turn smoothly, until it was time to be replaced. History doesn't record Spartacus's first training sessions. No one mentioned how many fights he won, or how many wounds he took. All we know is he survived long enough to stop wanting to spin with the gears. And then, One day, he decided, if I'm just a part of the machine, then I'll jam it. Capua, summer of the year 74 before Christ. A sunny day, hot enough that the sweat of thousands packed into the arena fermented into something almost like a festival. If you forgot, this was a place where people died for fun. The largest arena in southern Italy was about to host an important match, not for glory, but because a bloodthirsty crowd needed entertainment. And Spartacus, the man who once held a real sword for an ideal, was now brought in as the appetizer. Not the main dish, not the delicacy, just the crispy bite before the real blood started flowing. In the arena, there were no real names, only labels. Gallus, big, slow. Thracius, fast, reckless. Secutor, the hunter. Mumio, the living iron block. Spartacus was a mumio, a living iron block, heavy, relentless, terrifying. His opponent that day, Aritarius, light, quick, armed with net and trident. The crowd loved contrasts. Like watching a bear chase a rat, they didn't care who won. They just wanted blood. At the moment the Roman trumpet sounded, Spartacus stepped out from the iron gate, not to fight, but to be watched. Every step he took was a heartbeat for an ancient amusement, a man chosen to die on cue. The crowd clapped. Some threw bread down, as if rewarding a hunting dog. A child raised a thumb, mimicking his father, not to cheer, but to learn his first lesson in power. The higher you sit, the easier it is to watch someone get stabbed. He looked at the crowd. He didn't see hatred, just the coldness of habit. And then, the match began. No strategy, no honor, just two men. One wanted to live. The other was ordered to kill or be killed. Spartacus missed a strike. The Retiarius's net tangled his legs. The cheers exploded, like watching a juggler at the circus. But Spartacus didn't fall. He pulled back, snapped the trident's shaft, and, instead of killing his opponent, he just stood there, looking up at the stands. He waited for the verdict, the thumb, down. But that time, the crowd hesitated, not out of compassion, but because that man, in that moment, was no longer entertainment. He looked real, and so he was spared, not because he won, but because he made the entire arena feel inconvenient. History doesn't tell how many times Spartacus survived like that. All we know is, after each time he walked out of the arena, he carried something Rome couldn't measure. A look, a question, a crack. Capua, late summer of the year 73 before Christ. The heat still burned like a forge, and all roads still led to Rome. But this time, not to conquer, to escape. No one knows exactly who first spoke the plan aloud. Maybe it was Spartacus. Maybe it was some Gaul peeling a potato. Or maybe it was just a moment of despair slicing through a meal. Or maybe, like many uprisings in history, it began with a casual remark. "Want to run tonight?" The only thing certain, they escaped. With kitchen knives. No swords, no shields, no armor. Just dull bits of iron, shaky wooden handles, sometimes still slick with butter and raw meat. But it was enough, because for the first time, they refused to die on schedule. Roman history calls it the Spartacus Rebellion. But back then, no one thought of it as a revolution. It was just a group of hungry slaves, deciding to run toward a place without chains, running through the night, running from Capua, running from the cheers of the crowd, and running from their own fate. When the guards discovered it, they were stabbed with barbecue skewers. Some other slaves saw it and chose the side of kitchen knives. Some free farmers, landless, hopeless, joined too. The little escape began to spread like a crack in a groaning machine. They climbed Mount Vesuvius, not for vacation, but because there was nowhere else safe. A ragged crowd, no uniforms, no tactics, only the madness of those with nothing left to lose. Rome laughed. They sent Gaius Claudius Glaber, a barely remarkable magistrate, with 3,000 militia. The idea was to surround Mount Vesuvius, wait for the slaves to starve or tear each other apart. A solid plan, if the enemy hadn't been desperate cooks. Spartacus looked down the cliff, then looked at the vines growing at his feet. Can we climb these? A question that sounded like a joke, but that night it became the first elevator to defy an empire. That simple question gave birth to one of the most elegant counterattacks in ancient history. They braided the vines, made ladders, climbed down the cliff behind the Roman lines, in the dark, silent as cats, filthy, starving, but knowing exactly what waited below. Real weapons. When Glaber's men woke up, the only sound they heard was knives hitting wood, and then flesh. The Battle of Vesuvius ended quickly. The Romans fled. Weapons, shields, armor, everything was left behind. The slaves no longer had kitchen knives. Now they had swords. And Rome, for the first time, began to panic. Mount Vesuvius, early dawn. No one knows the exact day in the year 73 before Christ. All we know is that was the night a band of slaves carried vine ladders, and history began to flow in reverse. Rome had surrounded them with pure contempt. Gaius Claudius Glaber, a gentleman perhaps skilled at debating in the Senate, and maybe the first person to think, why would slaves climb a mountain? Unfortunately, history never forgives a lazy imagination. He had set up camp at the mountain's base, blocking the only path down. He thought, no path means no escape. Let them starve. The biggest mistake of rulers is assuming the cornered will stand still. Spartacus didn't need a path. He needed tree roots, a cliff face, and a touch of madness. The wild vines, once only used for wine, never imagined they'd one day be repurposed as anti-empire equipment. They weren't tasty, but they were tough, and tougher than Rome's patience. Braided by bare hands and the faith of people who had nothing left to lose, a vine ladder, stiff as a curse, was lowered down the cliff. If Rome was a machine, then that night was the moment the first gear cracked, not by steel, by vines. In absolute silence, small groups began to lower themselves down. No trumpets, no drums, only sweat, heartbeats, and breath heavy as wind through a vineyard. The last one down was Spartacus, and when his foot hit the ground, Rome was no longer surrounding. It was surrounded. Glaber's troops, militiamen who had never smelled battle, were dozing off, arms still wrapped around their helmets. No one expected that the tickle at their ears was actually the earliest alarm clock in recorded history. Not a fly, but a blade. The attack unfolded in chaos. Screams ripped through the fog. Fire rose from the Roman camp. Horses galloped in panic. And Spartacus, the man once known as number 17 in Capua, now stood in the middle of the battlefield with a real sword in his hand. Glaber lost nearly all his men. The rest fled, leaving behind armor, helmets, weapons, food, and a question never found in any military manual. How do you lose to a group of slaves, climbing down on vines? The victory at Vesuvius didn't win the war, but it landed the first blow that made Rome take half a step back. For the first time, an army of slaves, untrained, bannerless, had reversed a state siege by the strongest power in the Mediterranean. Not through strategy, not through miracles, but with something wild that grew in the woods and had always been deemed useless, just like them. Rome went quiet for a few weeks after, not for lack of soldiers, but because no one wanted to be the next to face the vines and hunger that had learned to wield a sword. People often assume to become a leader, you need noble blood, a throne, or at the very least, a cloak lined with fur. Spartacus had none of that. Only a name. No one was sure it was even real. A past, once sold like a sack of grain. And one strange thing, wherever he walked, people followed. Not because he radiated greatness, but because he had the eyes of someone who'd been beaten until even his name was gone. After the victory on Mount Vesuvius, the strange thing began to spread. Scattered groups of slaves, those thought to be beyond hope, started fleeing farms, forges, quarries, stables. They weren't just running away, they were running towards Spartacus. Some brought sickles, some brought rope, some brought children, house dogs, and unnamed dreams. Within just a few months, his army surpassed 70,000 people. If you call this a rebellious peasant force, then it was the largest group of peasants ever seen lining up and sharing meals on time. No coronation, no emblems, no oaths under flags, only a rage big enough to turn every step into a knock on Rome's door. But even in rage, there was order. Spartacus was not a grand speaker. He didn't study in Athens. But he knew something Rome never taught: how to make people believe you without shouting. He didn't quote Thucydides, didn't give speeches, but he shared spoils fairly, maintained discipline in camp, and strictly forbade attacks on civilians. Because he knew, if they became raiders, they would be no different from those who once chained them. People began comparing Spartacus to a king, even though he never claimed a throne. He wore no royal cloak. He wore old cloth, a head full of scars, and in the eyes of 70,000 people, that was enough. Where there is oppression, there is fire, and Spartacus was the spark. He never declared himself anything, but every action he took was a manifesto. Freedom needs no permission. It only needs someone willing to break the first chain. By now, Rome was growing uneasy. They had fought Carthage, faced nations with walls, cavalry, navies. But this time, they faced something far more terrifying: the stolen memories of 70,000 souls and the hunger to reclaim them. They had never imagined a slave nation on the move, with food, logistics, scouts, and worst of all, a man who made the entire empire afraid to sleep. Some said Spartacus only wanted to cross the Alps, disband the army, and go home. Others said he was aiming straight at the heart of Rome. No one knew for sure, but everyone understood one thing: this was no longer just a rebellion. This was a question thrown at the entire Roman Republic: is our blood worth less than yours? And that question still has no answer. Not everyone knows Crixus. He wasn't the one who started the rebellion. He had no snake omen on his face. He didn't stand at the center of legend. But in the greatest slave uprising in history, Spartacus never walked alone. And along that entire road, Crixus was the one always on his left side, shield in hand, eyes forward, as if always ready to take a spear for his friend. They say Crixus was a Gaul, a big, rough man, loud talker, loud laugher. He often rose earlier than everyone else, not to meditate, but to bang pots for breakfast on time. But when it came to dividing rations, he served himself last. On the march, he led from the front. In battle, he didn't need an audience. Maybe that's why people trusted him. And maybe that's why Spartacus gave him command of an independent force, nearly 30,000 men. In the year 72 before Christ, the Roman Republic lost its patience. They stopped sending militia, stopped testing the waters. They sent 2 consuls, Lentulus and Gellius, along with 2 full legions, trained, equipped, and ready to end everything. And they split their attack. Gellius went after Crixus. Crixus knew he didn't have enough troops. He didn't need omens to know he would lose. But he also knew some battles aren't fought to win, only to last long enough for someone else to respond. He knew he was cut off. He knew retreat would look like cowardice. He knew advancing would mean being swallowed whole. But still, he fought, not to win, but to give Spartacus enough time to pivot the entire front. The battle took place near Mount Garganus. Historians say over 2/3 of Crixus's army was killed, including Crixus himself. No one knows exactly when he fell. Only this: he didn't run. No shield was found turned backward. Every single one broke facing forward. When he heard the news, Spartacus was silent. They say he sacrificed 300 Roman prisoners in his friend's memory, not out of revenge, but as a proper funeral rite, in an era where slaves were not granted the right to die with dignity. Loyalty doesn't need vows. It only needs someone willing to draw their sword and walk into a place no one survives, because they know their friend needs time. And if Spartacus is the symbol of rebellion, then Crixus is the symbol of brotherhood, of a kind of man rare in Roman history, a man who didn't switch sides, didn't scheme, didn't speak, but was still remembered, a man who never let his friend fight alone. Crixus didn't return, but because of him, Spartacus lived. Because of him, Rome couldn't end the war. And because of him, history was forced to remember some deaths don't need victory to become immortal. If Spartacus's uprising was a fire, then Marcus Licinius Crassus was the bucket, huge and filled with oil. In the year 71 before Christ, Rome no longer had the patience to lose. They had lost face, lost officers, and most importantly, lost their pride. An empire that had once defeated Hannibal, once destroyed Carthage, was now letting a slave march 70,000 people around Italy like a weekend picnic. So they sent someone who didn't just have power, but had enough money to buy power. Crassus, the richest man in the Roman Republic, his wealth, according to historian Pliny, could be valued at more than 200 million sesterti, equivalent to billions of dollars today. No one was sure if Crassus loved Rome, but everyone was sure of one thing: he hated sharing credit with anyone. He didn't wait for the Senate to fund him. He used his own money to raise 6 new legions, equip them, train them, from soldier to soup pot. Then he absorbed the broken remains of 2 legions that had previously lost to Spartacus. Crassus didn't need grandeur. He didn't give speeches. He just gave orders. And when one of his subordinate generals, Mummius, disobeyed and lost, Crassus acted. He revived decimation, an ancient disciplinary punishment. Divide the troops into groups of 10 and kill 1 from each group for cowardice. This wasn't training. It was reform through terror. The result: Roman troops no longer ran, and for the first time in the entire campaign, Spartacus began to retreat. He fell back to southern Italy, trying to cross the sea to Sicily and regroup. But the Cilician pirates, after taking the gold, turned their ships and sailed away. With his back to the sea and supplies dwindling, Spartacus was cornered. Crassus wasn't in a hurry. He built fortifications around Spartacus, a wall that cut off all supply routes, 60 kilometers long. No fighting, no losses, just waiting. A segment of the rebels broke out and raided the countryside. Crassus immediately gave chase, crushed them, and discovered, among the more than 12,000 dead, only 2 had wounds in their backs. All the rest had died facing the enemy. Spartacus knew time was up. He gathered what remained, sent a messenger to negotiate peace, but Crassus refused. No negotiations, only an ending. And so, the final battle was about to begin. Crassus didn't need speeches like Caesar, didn't need golden eagle standards like Pompey. He only needed to win, because if he lost, he'd be the richest man, with the loudest laughter behind his back. A battle Crassus had to win, and Spartacus had no room left to lose. A cold morning in early spring, 71 before Christ, the wind from the Salarius region carried the smell of blood from days yet to come. Crassus was ready. Spartacus was too. 2 armies, 2 worlds. One side stood for glory and ambition, the other for freedom or death. They say Spartacus tried to negotiate. He knew he was at a disadvantage, but Crassus didn't want terms. He didn't want to sign. He wanted to seal with blood. Spartacus stood among his men. No horse, no golden armor, just a soldier, sword in hand. They say he led the first charge himself, cutting through Roman lines, trying to reach Crassus. Whether that was true or not, no one knows. Some Roman historians, like Plutarch, claimed he did, that he slashed his way forward, searching for Crassus. Others said it was just a story made up to spare an empire the shame of nearly losing to a slave. True or not, Rome needed that story to believe it had beaten a legend. But what they do know, he never turned his back. The Battle of Salarius wasn't a battle. It was a massacre. Rome overwhelmed them, but the slaves fought like they had nothing left to lose, and they truly had nothing. Yet before dying, many of them still sang, not a song of victory, but a song of those who had just begun to understand what freedom meant. Nearly 36,000 rebels were killed. Among them, none was Spartacus. Not because he survived, but because his body was never found. No one knows where Spartacus died. No grave, no head hung on a city gate, no crucified corpse. Only legend that he fell like a soldier, among comrades, in the dirt, blending into the fate of all those never granted a name. 6,000 survivors were captured. The Appian Way, once built to connect Rome's conquered lands, became a display of flesh and silence. No one dared walk it at sunset, because no one knew whose shadow they were stepping over. Every mile, every step was a warning that no one was allowed to dream beyond their chains. And Crassus, he won. He lived. But when he returned to Rome, Pompey, who only arrived in time to butcher 5,000 fleeing stragglers, received the triumph. They remembered Pompey. As for Crassus, despite destroying the entire rebel army, he was thanked with a handshake as cold as bronze. And so, the death of a slave without a body became the quiet shame of the man who won. Rome killed Spartacus, but couldn't kill the name from memory. So was he the first to fall, or the last to still stand in the memory of mankind? Spartacus is dead. No statue, no tomb, not a single line carved into marble. Nothing except humanity's unnamed longing. And yet, more than 2,000 years later, his name is still spoken, not as a king, not as a general, but as someone who simply refused to accept something too wrong, even though he knew he would lose. In Roman history, Spartacus was just a thorn plucked out, a rebellion crushed, a name scribbled on the margins beside Pompey, Crassus, Caesar. But in the imagination of the modern world, he is a symbol of freedom. In the 18th century, the French revolutionaries called his name. In the 19th century, black slaves in the Caribbean called his name. In the 20th century, those who fought for justice, from South Africa to Chicago, still called his name. Why? Because he did not stand for Rome, for the Republic, for Caesar, but for those who had nothing, except the desire to live as human beings. Hollywood once made a film about him. Hundreds of Spartacuses stood up in the arena, all shouting, "I am Spartacus." It wasn't a game. It was a way of saying, even if we lose, we still won't surrender. You don't have to win to be remembered. You don't need a throne to become a symbol. Sometimes, all it takes is refusing to kneel. Crassus won. Rome survived. Spartacus died. But when you ask anyone in the modern world, who would you rather be? They won't choose Crassus. They will say, "I am Spartacus."